The portrait that whispered back. Inspector Purbright, BBC detective story. Flaxborough in October had that particular stillness known only to provincial towns on the edge of the fens. A peace that felt earned rather than natural. The trees in the market square were just beginning to bronze, and the pavement smelled faintly of last night's rain. Miss Edna Truelove, secretary of the Flaxborough Art Society, walked briskly along Church Lane with her usual air of tidy determination. She carried the hall keys in one hand, a sheaf of meeting notes in the other, and the faint conviction that this morning would be exactly like any other. It was, of course, the last time she would think so. Inside the Art Society rooms, a converted Sunday school with creaking floors and excellent acoustics, the air was cooler than expected. A draught moved between the easels. Dust motes hung like suspended breath. She turned on the light and froze. The portrait of Alderman Copley, usually hung square above the piano, was gone. It was not missing entirely, for there it stood, leaned neatly against the far wall, as though moved with care. Yet no one had the right to move it. The alderman's widow, long since gone to Cheltenham, had donated it with explicit instructions that it command its original position. Miss Truelove adjusted her spectacles. She spoke aloud because silence in that hall seemed discourteous. "Who's been meddling?" Her voice echoed, and then, so quietly, she wondered if her ears played tricks. Another voice seemed to answer. A whisper.
Low male, uncertain. Something like,
"You did this." The sound seemed to come from the painted lips of the alderman himself. Miss Truelove dropped her papers. When Sergeant Love of the local constabulary arrived 15 minutes later, he found her seated on a chair with both hands clutching her handbag as though it contained the 10 Commandments. She reported in crisp tones that the portrait had spoken. Love had known Miss Truelove since school days, and while she had her peculiarities, chiefly an inability to let silence rest, she was not fanciful. He promised a full inspection, peered dutifully behind the frame, and found nothing more than dust and a faint smell of tobacco. By mid-morning, the Art Society's little drama had fluttered through the high street. The portrait had whispered, they said. Whispered blame or warning or perhaps confession. At the station, Inspector Purbright read the incident note with mild amusement. It was the sort of local fancy that required tea more than inquiry. Yet something about the phrase "you did this" caught his attention. Voices, after all, had owners and ownership, moral or otherwise, or one more was something he understood well. That afternoon he strolled to the Art Society under a sky the colour of pewter. The wind had quieted, though it still worried at the bunting left from last week's flower show. Purbright's steps were unhurried. He was never one to chase mystery, only to allow it to introduce itself. Inside, Miss Truelove was instructing a junior member on the importance of respect for the dead and their likenesses. Her expression softened only slightly when Purbright entered. "Inspector," she said, gathering composure, "you may think me fanciful, but I assure you the voice was as real as yours." Purbright inclined his head. "And perhaps it would be impolite not to listen." He stood before the portrait. The painted alderman regarded him with that smug benevolence unique to municipal benefactors. The varnish caught the light like old amber. "An impressive likeness," Purbright said quietly. "Do you suppose he was ever this silent in life?" Miss Truelove hesitated. "He was known to express opinions." "Indeed," murmured Purbright. "And some opinions linger longer than the man who held them." He looked once more at the portrait, at the faint disturbance of dust along the wall where it had been rehung. Then, in the still air, came the faintest scent. Old pipe tobacco, out of place and unlit. Purbright smiled to himself, the kind of smile that promised thought, not conclusion. By evening, word had spread. The alderman had spoken, and in Flaxborough, That was quite enough to set every tongue whispering in turn. By the following morning, Flaxborough had achieved the rare equilibrium of gossip, half believed, half denied, and entirely enjoyed. The tale of the talking portrait had expanded like breath on glass. Each retelling gathered warmth from the speaker's imagination. In Mrs. Glossop's version, the alderman's painted eyes had moved. In the hairdresser's, he had sighed. And by the time the tale reached the high street tea rooms, the whisper had become a confession. Though whose, precisely, no one could say. Rain pressed faintly against the panes of Baines's Tea Emporium, where a cluster of respectable matrons fortified themselves with currant buns and disbelief. Mrs. Glossop, a woman of decided convictions and indeterminate age, occupied her usual seat beneath the portrait of Queen Mary. It was his voice, she declared, pausing to stir her tea as though to underline the certainty. The alderman's own. You could hear the authority in it. Across the table, Mrs. Povey raised a doubtful brow. Voices can be imagined, Ethel. Not by Edna Truelove, said Mrs. Glossop. That woman hasn't imagined a thing in her life. It was him, or someone who knew him rather well. The others murmured appreciatively, grateful for something more flavourful than the weather. Through the steamy windows the high street gleamed, a world of umbrellas and purposeful gossip. A little before 11, a man passed outside, head bowed against the drizzle. Mr. Tulliver, the Art Society's assistant, his portfolio clutched close. His step quickened as he caught sight of the women within. Mrs. Glossop followed him with narrowed eyes. There goes the lad who cleans the frames, she said softly. A nervous creature,
and always lurking about when that portrait's mentioned. Mark my words, he knows something. It was an accusation delivered with all the gentility of small-town malice. Soft.
But barbed. That afternoon, Inspector Purbright received an informal report of the same suspicions. Love, with his usual dogged patience, had spoken to several society members. Nothing criminal, sir, he said, setting a damp notebook on Purbright's desk. But they all mention this Tulliver. Seems he was fond of experimenting with sound recorders.
Had one for making art lectures.
Someone suggested he might have,
rigged something. Purbright lifted an eyebrow. And the motive?
Attention, maybe.
Or a joke gone wrong. The inspector leaned back, studying the rain as it blurred the police yard windows.
In Flaxborough, jokes seldom go wrong. They simply last too long. Love smiled faintly, uncertain if that was humour or warning. Purbright, meanwhile, reached for his hat.
I think I shall call on our Mr. Tulliver before the town.
Completes his trial by teapot. He found the young man in a narrow attic studio above the greengrocer's. The room smelled of turpentine and lonely hours. Canvases leaned like forgotten arguments against the walls. Tulliver, pale and narrow as a paintbrush, seemed startled by the knock. Inspector, I've done nothing wrong. Few people do, Mr. Tulliver, said Purbright gently, stepping inside. But they often believe they have. It's a curious thing about conscience. It needs very little encouragement to whisper. Tulliver tried to smile, but the corners of his mouth betrayed him.
I think I made that voice. I didn't. I wouldn't frighten Miss Truelove. She's always been kind. Indeed, said Purbright, glancing at the heap of sketchbooks.
May I? The sketches were of faces. Dozens of them. Some watchful, some wary, one or two almost pleading. He paused at a small study of the alderman's portrait. The likeness was careful, but the eyes were altered, softer, sadder. You've changed him, Purbright murmured. Tulliver flushed.
I only painted what I thought he might have looked like before he became.
What he became? A local benefactor?
A man who liked power, said Tulliver quietly, and the sound of his own voice.
Outside, the wind pressed at the window, and a church bell sounded the half-hour. Purbright replaced the sketch gently. Did you ever record him, Mr. Tulliver? The young man looked up sharply. Record him?
No, but others did.
He had a gramophone made of his speeches. People used to laugh about it. He'd play them back after dinner? Do you know where that recording might be now? Tulliver shook his head. Maybe still in the Society's cupboard. They never throw anything away. Purbright nodded almost to himself. No, they prefer their ghosts properly catalogued. When he left, the sky had begun to clear, and the cobbles gleamed like pewter plates. He walked slowly, his mind turning over the fragments. A moved portrait, a whisper shaped like guilt, and a town eager to believe in anything but human contrivance. At the corner of Market Lane, Mrs. Glossop intercepted him, as she often intercepted anyone bearing news.
"Inspector, I hope you're not letting that young man off lightly." Purbright regarded her with polite gravity.
I find, Mrs. Glossop, that guilt, like rainwater, seeps toward the lowest cracks. Best not to declare the puddle before the storm is over. She blinked.
"I beg your pardon?"
A fancy of speech, he said pleasantly, and tipped his hat. As dusk gathered, he returned to the Art Society. The hall was empty, save for the portrait rehung in its place, silent and faintly luminous under the gaslight. He stood before it again, listening not for words, but for what silence might admit. The varnish had darkened slightly, giving the alderman's expression a look almost penitent. Purbright could smell the faintest residue of pipe smoke once more. He moved behind the piano, traced the skirting board with a gloved hand, and found nothing, only the hollow resonance of the old walls. Then, from the doorway, Miss Truelove's voice. "Inspector."
"You think someone's hiding something, don't you?"
He turned, smiling. "In Flaxborough, Miss Truelove, someone always is." A clock somewhere struck 7. The echo lingered like breath, and in that dim light, the painted eyes of Alderman Copley seemed almost to follow him as he left.
As if amused that his whisper had travelled so far, through windows, through words,
through every heart that secretly longed to hear it again. The following morning brought a stillness that only a misted town can manage. Sounds subdued, colours softened, and every surface filmed with quiet uncertainty. The Art Society, viewed through the haze, seemed almost to float above its own reflection in the wet cobbles. Inspector Purbright arrived without fanfare. He disliked the way attention distorted conversation, and preferred instead the modest entrance of a man seeking nothing more than a signature. His umbrella tapped once upon the stone step. The echo carried faintly into the hall, where voices paused. Inside, the committee had gathered, Miss Truelove at her post, Mr. Worsley polishing spectacles he scarcely needed, Mrs. Glossop pretending to have been summoned officially, and young Mr. Tulliver seated slightly apart, as though expecting reprimand or rescue. "Inspector Purbright," Miss Truelove said, rising with ceremonial precision. "We didn't expect—" "No one ever does," he replied gently. "That's what makes visits bearable." He laid his hat on the piano, looked around, and for a moment said nothing. The silence thickened. The portrait of Alderman Copley regarded them all with varnished disdain. Purbright turned toward it with the mild curiosity of a man greeting a familiar ghost. "He's back in his rightful place, I see." "Yes," Miss Truelove said. "I supervise personally. No further disturbances have occurred." "Splendid," said Purbright. "It's always good when the dead cooperate." A faint rustle of unease moved through the room. Only Tulliver gave a nervous chuckle, quickly regretted. Purbright strolled toward the wall, studying the frame. "You've had this hung here since the alderman's passing, I believe?" "Nearly 12 years, Miss Truelove answered. "We only take it down for cleaning, which I did myself last spring." Purbright nodded, running a finger lightly along the lower edge.
"Curious thing about portraits.
They preserve vanity far longer than life ever could."
I suppose that's why we trust them. They're static." Mrs. Glossop could not resist. "Static, Inspector, but not silent." The room stiffened.
Purbright half turned, the ghost of amusement crossing his face.
"Ah, yes, the voice." "It was real," said Miss Truelove firmly.
"I know the sound of imagination, Inspector. It wasn't mine. I quite believe you," Purbright said. Imagination tends to flatter its owner. Yours, I think, would have been more complimentary. There was a subdued titter, the kind of laughter that eases tension while creating new discomfort. Purbright allowed it to settle. His eyes, when they returned to the portrait, were thoughtful rather than mocking. "Do you suppose," he said slowly, "that a voice might sometimes come from guilt rather than trickery?" Miss Truelove blinked. "Guilt, Inspector?"
Not your own, of course.
"The town's, or perhaps the alderman's. Paint can't lie, but it can conceal a good deal." He stepped back, hands clasped behind him. "I wonder," he continued, "what a painter hides when he smooths over the last layer. Sometimes a detail, sometimes a feeling. Occasionally a truth that refuses to be quiet." Mr. Worsley coughed politely. "If you mean to suggest a ghost, sir, the Society doesn't support that sort of influence." "Nor do I," said Purbright. "Influence suggests direction."
"I find these matters usually wander where they please." He allowed the words to hang like the dust motes, then turned to Tulliver.
"You've done work here recently." "Some, yes," Tulliver murmured. "Cleaning, mending frames, arranging exhibits. Excellent. No harm in being useful." Purbright smiled faintly. "Tell me, did you notice any sign that the portrait had been disturbed before Miss Truelove found it moved?" Tulliver hesitated, glancing at the others.
"Only—"
The smell of smoke. "Pipe smoke."
It was faint, but familiar.
"Yes," said the young man. "The alderman used to smoke a particular blend."
"Everyone knew it. Convenient," murmured Purbright.
"The dead do like their habits." Mrs. Glossop drew in a breath. "Are you saying someone recreated him, Inspector?" "I'm saying," Purbright replied, "that people tend to resurrect what they miss, or what they fear might be forgotten." He crossed to the window. Outside, the fog pressed close, blurring the town into a single pale shape. He stood a moment, hands in pockets, listening to the muted sounds beyond the glass. Cartwheels, a dog, the clock of St. Chad's marking 11. When he turned again, his voice was mild but precise. "Miss Truelove, who holds the keys to this building?" "Only myself and Mr. Worsley," she said. "Oh, the caretaker sometimes." "Mr. Lunn?" "Yes, but he's been in hospital since Monday." "Then we may eliminate him as our conversational spirit." Purbright retrieved his hat from the piano. "I shan't trouble you further for now." Mrs. Glossop looked disappointed.
"So there's no culprit?"
"There's seldom just one," he said, pausing at the door. "In most matters, guilt is communal, like jam at a church fete." Her lips parted for a retort, but he had already stepped out into the mist. The air carried the faint metallic smell of rain on stone. Purbright walked slowly toward the square, his umbrella unopened, his mind turning over a phrase that had formed while he stood before the portrait. Vanity painted over guilt. He murmured it under his breath, testing the rhythm. There was something in it, not poetry, precisely, but motive. At the corner, he paused to watch a window cleaner polishing the glass of the haberdashery. Each swipe of the cloth erased another reflection. Beneath the smear of moisture, faces blurred, reshaped, disappeared. Purbright watched until the man moved on, leaving behind a pane as clear as confession. Back at the station, he found Sergeant Love bent over a stack of reports. The room smelled faintly of wet boots and tea. "Any progress with our haunted portrait?" Love asked. Purbright hung up his coat.
"Not haunted, I think. Simply restless, like most memorials." "Restless, sir?" "Every tribute conceals a transaction, Love. Someone wanted that picture moved."
"Not stolen, not spoiled, but merely displaced. As if to remind us that the past refuses to stay where it's put." Love frowned. "Could be mischief." "It could," Purbright agreed. "Or it could be memory protesting its frame." He glanced toward the fog-dimmed window. Somewhere beyond, the Art Society's lights would soon be switched off, the hall locked, the portrait once again alone with its secrets. Purbright smiled faintly, as though at some private joke. "Vanity painted over guilt," he murmured again. "Yes, that seems about the right medium." The clock on the wall ticked evenly, precise as breath. Outside, the rain began again, soft, persistent,
unending, like a voice no one quite wanted to hear.
but no one could entirely ignore. By Friday morning, Flaxborough had arranged its nerves into a pattern of composure. The portrait's whisper was no longer frightful, merely fashionable. What had begun as unease was now a parlour amusement, one of those charming oddities that lent a town its personality. The Flaxborough Chronicle devoted half a column to it beneath the heading, "Spiritualism Among Watercolours." The writer, emboldened by editorial irony, described the incident as a humorous echo of Victorian fancy, quite in keeping with the town's cultured spirit. A small line beneath noted that the police, ever obliging, have discovered no evidence of haunting. Inspector Purbright read it over breakfast. His coffee steamed beside the folded paper, his expression thoughtful but not displeased. Comfort, he knew, was the natural state of Flaxborough. Discomfort was simply a pause between pot plants. At the station, Sergeant Love shared the town's relief. "Good thing it's settled, sir. A prank, most likely. That Tulliver lad's been quiet since. Miss Truelove says the atmosphere's back to normal." Purbright stirred sugar into his tea, watching the swirl dissolve. "Normality," he murmured, "is often a layer of varnish, smooth, reflective, and occasionally concealing a crack." Love smiled uncertainly. "Still nothing more's happened." "No," Purbright said. "And yet, if it were truly a prank, we should have had another by now. Jesters don't leave their audiences satisfied after the first laugh." He rose, took his hat, and stepped out into the thin sunlight that had replaced the week's fog. The air smelled faintly of apples and coal smoke. As he crossed the square, bells from St. Chad's tolled the hour. Bright, contented, and profoundly incurious, inside the Chronicle office, young Mr. Vickers, the reporter responsible for the piece, greeted him with eager civility. "Good morning, Inspector."
"Came to see your mention, did you?" "Not precisely," Purbright replied. "I came to see yours," Vickers flushed.
"I only thought to ease the public mind. We can't have panic over painted aldermen." "No, indeed," Purbright said mildly, although panic, in moderation, can be rather informative. He accepted a chair and glanced about the office, paper stacks leaning like exhausted arguments, an ink bottle perched perilously close to the edge of a desk. "Tell me," he said, "who first suggested it was a prank?" Vickers hesitated. "I suppose everyone. The Art Society, mostly. Mrs. Glossop, I think, said it must have been young Tulliver." "A comforting culprit," Purbright observed. "Harmless, pliable, and unlikely to protest too loudly." The reporter laughed nervously. "Well, he is the sort who might try something clever to impress Miss Truelove." Purbright's expression barely changed. "Cleverness," he said, "is often misjudged in proportion to its motive. A man may move a portrait for many reasons."
"Few of them have to do with art," Vickers swallowed.
"Do you believe it wasn't a prank, then?" "I believe," said Purbright, rising, "that some truths wear masks simply because the town prefers them that way. Thank you for your time." Outside again, the day had grown brighter, but not warmer. He walked past the greengrocers, the milliners, the tobacconists, each shopkeeper nodding with the wary cheer reserved for authority on casual errands. At the Art Society, Miss Truelove was arranging chrysanthemums in a glass vase. She looked up at his entrance with practiced serenity.
"Inspector,
I suppose you've seen the newspaper."
I'm rather relieved to tell the truth."
The idea of haunting was absurd. "Absurdity," Purbright said, "is often a refuge for the nervous." She frowned. "You think there's more to it?" "I think," he said, examining the portrait again, "that someone wished to remind us of the alderman's voice. That sort of tribute can serve many purposes: pride, guilt, persuasion." Miss Truelove hesitated. "You speak as though it were deliberate." "Perhaps it was," he replied softly. "Perhaps it was meant for one listener, not all." Her hand tightened on the vase. Water trembled against the rim. You mean a message? Purbright smiled faintly. Flaxborough rarely sends messages, Miss Truelove. It prefers implications. He turned to go, but paused at the door. By the way, he added, if any visitors should ask to view the portrait privately,
I'd be obliged if you'd note their names. Of course, she said,
though her voice carried a shadow of unease. As evening fell, Purbright sat once more in his office, the day's light fading across the floorboards. Love brought in the evening post, unpaid bills, a misplaced constable's report, and one small envelope unsigned. Inside was a clipping from an older edition of the Chronicle, Alderman Copley to fund school hall renovation, speech recorded for posterity. In the margin, someone had written, in a shaky hand, he said more than he meant to. Purbright read it twice. The handwriting was faintly tremulous, feminine. He slipped it into his notebook, closed the cover, and regarded the lamplight reflected in the window. Flaxborough, beyond the glass, lay quiet again. Tidy, content, self-convinced. Yet he sensed beneath its comfort a faint vibration, like a note held too long after the music has stopped. He reached for his teacup, found it empty, and smiled. A neat explanation, he said softly, but rarely a true one. Then he extinguished the lamp. The sound of the match fading was the only thing that dared disturb the silence. The next morning brought rain, a fine, unhurried drizzle that settled into the cobbles and left the air smelling of soot and wet leaves. In Flaxborough, such weather encouraged reflection, or at least postponement. Shop blinds stayed half-drawn, and those who ventured out did so at a pace that suggested duty rather than desire. Inspector Purbright, however, was early at his desk. Before him lay the small envelope from the night before, its edges softened with handling. The note inside, he said more than he meant to, had been written on the sort of paper used for club minutes or mild confessions. He tapped it lightly with his forefinger, then rose, reached for his hat, and went out into the mist. At the Art Society, the key turned reluctantly in the lock, as though the building itself resented disturbance. Inside, the air was close, faintly sweet with polish and chrysanthemums now past their best. Purbright moved quietly, his footsteps echoing across the wooden floor. He stood before the alderman's portrait once more. The painted eyes caught the dull morning light, their expression poised between satisfaction and reproach. Purbright tilted his head, studying the lower corner where the frame met the wall. There, a thin thread of dust hung loose, newly disturbed. He reached for his handkerchief, pressed a finger along the edge, and found the faintest impression of residue. Old glue, perhaps, or oil, the sort that clings to hands accustomed to paint. When he shifted the frame gently forward, something slid free and fell to the floor. A single glove, worn thin at the fingertips, mottled faintly with dried pigment. He crouched, examining it. The paint was grey, with a trace of greenish tint, a mixture favoured for underpainting shadows. He turned it over. Along the hem, in faded ink, were the initials E.T. Purbright. Replaced the glove carefully on the table beside the piano and exhaled through his nose. Not surprise exactly, but recognition. "Edna Truelove," he murmured, "I do believe you've been tidier than intended." He glanced again at the portrait, and for the first time noticed something faintly irregular in the background. A small ridge beneath the paint, no larger than a fingernail, invisible except at an angle. He leaned closer, and the faint aroma of tobacco, long cold but distinct, met him like a half-forgotten memory. Footsteps sounded behind him. Miss Truelove's voice followed, brisk but slightly tremulous. "Inspector." "You again?" "Good morning," Purbright said without turning. "You've a gift for timing." "I thought I'd better check the flowers," she replied, setting her handbag down with an unnecessary firmness. "Yesterday's rain made the air dreadfully damp." "Quite so," said Purbright. though I doubt the alderman minds. He's looked worse weather in his day." Her laugh was thin, polite. Then she saw the glove. The sound died. "Oh," she said. "Where did you—" "Behind the portrait," Purbright answered. "Odd place for laundry." "I can explain that," she began quickly. "I wore them while dusting. The paint flakes sometimes." "Indeed." Purbright turned the glove over. "Grey and green pigments. Not the colour of dust, I think. More the shade of correction." She hesitated, her lips tightening. "You mean paint?"
"Among other things," he said mildly.
"I suppose it depends what one is attempting to cover." A silence stretched between them, filled only by the rain tapping at the high windows. Purbright studied her face, careful, composed, yet betraying a nervous flicker about the mouth. At last, she said, "You think I moved it?" "I think," Purbright replied, "someone moved it. Whether by guilt or affection remains to be seen, though the two often share a palette." Her composure wavered.
I couldn't bear—" She stopped, pressing a hand to her handbag, as if it contained a steadier version of herself.
"The alderman was unkind to many of us, Inspector. Even in memory he manages to intrude." "Then it was intrusion you meant to silence?" She looked at him sharply, then away.
"No, only to put him right again. That's all, right?"
"The painting was crooked," she said softly, or seemed so.
"I wanted it level, but when I touched it—"
Something shifted inside. It rattled. Purbright inclined his head. "Something inside the frame?"
"Yes, I thought it might be dust or an insect."
I loosened a corner and found a folded paper wedged behind the canvas.
I was frightened." It had his handwriting. "What became of it?"
She hesitated. "I don't know."
"I left it there." Purbright's gaze rested on her long enough to suggest disbelief, but he said nothing.
Instead, he stepped closer to the portrait and examined the back with care. The paper was still there, a thin envelope, browned with age and half-torn open. He eased it free and unfolded it. The handwriting was large, confident, and unmistakably self-assured. A man's hand used to being read aloud. It was addressed simply, "To be opened only if I am misunderstood." Inside was a single line. "I took nothing that wasn't already owed." Purbright read it twice, then refolded it and slid it into his pocket. Miss Truelove's eyes followed him anxiously. "Is it—" "Cryptic," he said. "Like most epitaphs," she swallowed. "Will there be—"
"Trouble?"
"There always is," Purbright said gently. "The question is whether it's polite enough to knock first." He took the glove, thanked her for her time, and left her standing beneath the portrait, her face pale, her eyes lifted as though the painted man might answer. Outside, the rain had eased, leaving the streets slick and gleaming. Purbright walked slowly toward the station, the faint scent of tobacco still clinging to his sleeve. By the time he reached his office, Love was waiting with a sheaf of notes and the eagerness of one who suspects good gossip. "Something new, sir?" Purbright set the glove on the desk. "Several somethings. A glove, a letter, a scent, and a lie. Not necessarily in that order." Love frowned. "What do they mean?" Purbright smiled thinly. "Nothing yet. Threads never do until they knot." He leaned back, watching the smoke from his pipe drift upward in patient spirals. "It's an interesting thing, love. How fear hides best behind laughter. A ghost story, for instance, is much easier to share than a confession." "Then you think it wasn't a prank after all?" Purbright's eyes narrowed. Thoughtful, kind. "No, love. I think someone in this tidy town has been whispering to themselves for quite a long time. And the portrait, poor fellow, merely gave their conscience a frame." Outside, the rain began again, softer now, like memory trying to speak. The next 2 days passed like paint drying, slowly, with a deceptive calm that only accentuated what lay beneath. Flaxborough's neat rhythms resumed, though conversation in the grocer's queue or outside the post office still began with that sly preface. "Between ourselves, of course." Inspector Purbright spent the mornings walking, his steps measured, and his gaze almost idle. He preferred to gather truth the way others collected gossip, by allowing it to approach him uninvited. The rain had washed the town clean, yet left a faint smell of damp brick and turned soil. Curtains twitched discreetly as he passed. His first call was at Mr. Worsley's studio, a converted attic above a stationer's shop. The air was thick with varnish and self-importance. Worsley himself, wearing a velvet waistcoat too hopeful for his years, greeted the inspector with effusive caution. "I trust this isn't official business," he said, half smiling. "Everything in Flaxborough is unofficial until it proves otherwise," Purbright replied pleasantly. He examined a half-finished portrait on the easel, a respectable lady rendered without mercy. "Fine work," he observed. "You've captured her sincerity exactly now by leaving it out." Worsley preened, uncertain whether to be flattered. "I strive for honesty in expression." "Indeed," said Purbright. "An honesty in portraiture must be exhausting. Tell me, Mr. Worsley, did Alderman Copley sit for you?" The painter hesitated.
Well, yes, once or twice, years ago."
"Commissioned by the council, naturally." "Ah," murmured Purbright. "So that's how the likeness began." From life, Worsley busied himself cleaning brushes. A most obstinate sitter, wanted to appear thinner, younger, more benevolent, as the dead often do, Purbright said softly. "You wouldn't happen to know who finished the painting after you, would you?" "Finished?" "The hand changes in the lower right," Purbright said. "Different stroke."
"A touch less vanity, a touch more mercy," Worsley blinked.
"Miss Truelove tidied it, I think, after his death. She was devoted to him. Professionally, of course." "Of course," said Purbright, watching the man's face.
"And did devotion ever sour into resentment?"
"Good heavens, Inspector, I'm an artist, not a gossip." "An enviable distinction," Purbright replied, "though I've yet to meet one who paints without listening." He left Worsley flustered among his turpentine fumes and continued along High Street toward the river. A milk float rattled by, its driver whistling the tune of Annie Laurie. The sound faded into the hush of morning, and with it came the faint toll of a bell, a soft reminder that time, unlike rumour, moved only forward. His next visit was to Mrs. Glossop, who opened her door before he had the chance to knock. "I knew you'd come," she announced with satisfaction. Purbright removed his hat.
"Premonition or preparation, Mrs. Glossop?" "Observation," she said crisply.
"You've that look of a man following voices," he smiled faintly. "Flaxborough provides a chorus." "Not all of them human," she replied, leading him to the parlour. The room was a museum of crochet and curiosity, framed samplers, commemorative plates, and the smell of polished pride. "I've been saying it from the start," she continued, pouring tea. "What happened at that art society was conscience, Inspector. Conscience never dies. It just changes its address." Purbright accepted his cup, watching the steam curl. "A theological position?" "A practical one," she said. "People think guilt fades when someone's gone."
"It doesn't. It lingers while in places, in objects."
"That portrait's a receptacle, you mark my words." "Perhaps," said Purbright, "though I find guilt prefers subtler accommodations. Letters, keepsakes, the odd unfinished promise." Mrs. Glossop leaned forward. "Then you agree it wasn't a prank?" "I agree," Purbright said evenly. "That no one whispers without need, for a moment." The only sound was the clock on the mantel, its steady tick like breath between unspoken truths. "Tell me," he asked, "how well did Miss Truelove and the alderman know one another?" Mrs. Glossop sniffed, delighted to be asked. "Too well, perhaps." She admired him dreadfully, wrote all his speeches. Some say she softened his tone, others that she sharpened it. Depend on who you ask. And after his death, she organized everything, the memorial, the portrait, the society meetings. It was her monument as much as his, Purbright nodded. And people rarely alter monuments unless they mean to correct history. Mrs. Glossop smiled shrewdly. "You think she's hiding something?" "I think," he said, setting down his cup, "that everyone is. It's the foundation of civility." As he stepped out again, the afternoon light had turned watery and pale. The streets were bright with puddles that reflected chimney pots and the slow drift of clouds. A faint wind carried the mingled smells of river mud and tobacco smoke. He followed it down to the quay where the town's quieter trades were carried on. Carpenters, upholsterers, and a painter who repaired old signs. The man looked up from his work as Purbright approached. "Morning, Inspector. You've an eye for bad weather." "Or bad temper," Purbright replied. "Either will do." He watched the craftsman strip flaking paint from a board marked Copley and Sons, Timber Merchants. The name was half erased. Did they go out of business? Purbright asked, years back. The alderman sold the lot. Some said he cheated his partner, a Mr. Holt, I think, out of his share. Do you know what became of Mr. Holt? The painter shrugged. Dead, like most of them. Left a daughter, though. Married a Tulliver. You'll know the name? Purbright's eyes narrowed slightly. Ah, so young Mr. Tulliver's connection to the alderman was not entirely artistic. Seems not, sir. The inspector thanked him, walked a little further along the quay, and paused at the bridge. Beneath it, the river carried slow brown water, rippling faintly against the supports. Something about its unhurried movement appealed to him. Constant, patient, quietly revealing what it carried. He lit his pipe, the flame flickering in the wind, and drew, once before, speaking softly to himself.
Ambition, envy, love misplaced.
All excellent motives. But guilt, guilt is the only one that paints itself in layers. He turned back toward town. The lamplighters were just beginning their rounds, poles glinting in the damp twilight. Through a window he glimpsed Miss Truelove seated alone, her back straight, her face lit by the mild glow of a reading lamp. Before her on the table lay a sheet of paper, folded carefully. Her hand hovered above it, as though she meant to write, or perhaps to erase. In the square, Purbright stopped for a moment, listening. The town had resumed its evening murmur, a cartwheel on stone, the faint laughter of two girls beneath umbrellas, the rhythm of life continuing polite and content under the sound of its own secrets. He smiled faintly, as if greeting an old acquaintance. Voices of conscience, he murmured. Mrs. Glossop may be right after all. The trick is knowing whose. The clock of St. Chad's struck 6, its echoes soft against the mist. Purbright's reflection wavered in a puddle at his feet. A shadowed shape moving through the calm, neither hurried nor idle, like a man tracing the faintest thread between what was said and what was meant. It began, as such moments often do, with something so ordinary that no one thought to be afraid. The Art Society had gathered that Thursday evening for its monthly lecture. The Character of Light in Portraiture. Miss Truelove presided, composed and pale beneath the gas sconces. The hall was full enough to suggest the town's curiosity had not cooled, though laughter ran lightly through the room, the laughter of those who mock what still unsettles them. Inspector Purbright sat near the back,
Ostensibly as guest, though everyone knew observation was his profession.
He listened to the soft rustle of programs, the click of the projector, the small coughs of expectation. Mr. Worsley, resplendent in another waistcoat of ambitious colour, began to speak on the virtues of contrast and restraint. Light, he declared, reveals character. It flatters or betrays as the painter commands. The honest hand allows the truth to appear only where it is deserved. His words echoed slightly, bouncing off the high ceiling. Purbright let his gaze drift to the portrait of Alderman Copley, which now hung again in its rightful place above the piano. The gaslight trembled faintly across the varnish, giving the painted face a faint sheen of perspiration. Halfway through the lecture, as Worsley discoursed on the subtleties of tonal composition, the lamps flickered. Someone murmured. Another laughed nervously. The light steadied again, dimmer now, and oddly yellow. Then it came. A voice, low but clear, rose from the direction of the portrait. Tulliver. The name hung in the air like smoke. The audience froze. For a heartbeat, the room contained nothing but breathing, dozens of held breaths. Then came the scraping of a chair. Young Tulliver, seated in the second row, had gone white as plaster. He stood abruptly. "Who said that?" No one answered. Only the whisper of gas through the lamps and the slow tick of the wall clock replied. Miss Truelove clutched her notes. "Please, everyone remain calm." But calm had already left. Mrs. Glossop rose, whispering something about possession. Mr. Worsley stepped back from the podium, colour draining from his cheeks. Purbright's voice, when it came, was soft but decisive. "Turn the lights full up, if you please." The caretaker obeyed. The lamps flared. The portrait's surface glistened. The alderman's painted lips, motionless, seemed somehow guilty of movement. Purbright walked to the front, his steps slow, unhurried. The crowd parted instinctively. He studied the frame, the edges, the wall behind. Nothing stirred but the faint vibration of the lamps. Then he turned to Tulliver. "You heard it clearly?" "Yes," the young man whispered. "It said my name. And you are certain it was not your own imagination speaking?" Tulliver shook his head helplessly. "It wasn't in my voice." "Voices rarely are," Purbright said. He examined the lower section of the wall and gestured to the caretaker. "Remove the piano, if you would." The men obeyed, revealing a narrow vent set into the skirting, old, almost forgotten. Purbright knelt, ran a finger across the grill, and held it up to the light. A trace of soot.
A hint of oil. He looked at the portrait again, and something flickered in his eyes. Not triumph, but understanding. "Miss Truelove," he said quietly, "may I see your storeroom?"
She hesitated. "Now?" "Yes," he replied. Voices grow shy when interrupted. The storeroom lay behind a narrow door at the side of the hall. Its air was cool, thick with the mingled smells of canvas, linseed, and thyme. Purbright stepped inside, eyes adjusting to the gloom. On a small table lay a phonograph, one of the Society's relics from its earlier days, its horn dulled with dust. He ran a hand along the cylinder and found faint scratches around its base, where it had recently been wound. "Curious," he murmured. A relic kept in perfect working order. Miss Truelove stood in the doorway, her face drawn. "We used it for demonstrations years ago."
"I forgot it was still here." "Forgotten things often prove the most articulate," he said. He pressed the lever.
The cylinder turned. For a moment there was only static, a hiss like breath. Then, faint, crackling, unmistakable, the voice of Alderman Copley emerged. "Tulliver will answer for it." The machine clicked to silence. Miss Truelove gasped, clutching the doorframe. Purbright waited, then stopped the mechanism. "No haunting, then?"
"Merely rehearsal.
"Of guilt," he said softly. Someone wished to summon the dead, not to terrify, but to accuse.
A most civilized vengeance. He replaced the needle, turned the crank again, and listened to the second fragment. The same voice, slower, weighted with self-importance. "I took nothing that wasn't owed." The same words from the letter.
Purbright nodded once, as though confirming an old suspicion. When he returned to the hall, the audience had thinned. Only a few lingered, Worsley, Mrs. Glossop, and poor Tulliver, still rigid with disbelief. Purbright spoke gently. "You may all rest easy. The alderman is not returned from the grave. He merely lingers, as the ambitious tend to do." Mrs. Glossop clutched her handbag. "Then who made him speak?" Purbright looked toward Miss Truelove. She met his gaze, colourless, her lips parting as if to confess, then closing again. "That," Purbright said, "is a matter for daylight." The others dispersed reluctantly. When at last the hall was empty, he turned once more to the portrait. The lamplight had softened. The painted eyes seemed to have resumed their silence. Purbright stood quite still, listening to the faint ticking of the clock. Then very quietly, he spoke, not to the others, not even to the painted man, but to the room itself. "Danger," he said, "not of ghosts, but of remembrance. Someone has found that words once buried can still wound the living." A gust moved through the hall, stirring the curtains. The gaslight trembled, casting the alderman's face briefly in shadow. And in that shadow, for an instant, Purbright thought he saw another expression altogether. Regret. Or perhaps relief. It was hard to tell where paint ended and conscience began. He extinguished the lamps one by one. The last sound was the click of his lighter as he drew on his pipe, the ember glowing faintly. A single, calm light against the whispering dark. The next morning, mist lay across the town like a sheet not yet drawn back from the day. Flaxborough stirred cautiously, blinds half raised, shop doors opening with the discreet creak of habit. The night's excitement had not vanished. It merely slept shallowly. In every conversation, Inspector Purbright walked from the police station toward the Art Society with the unhurried composure of a man approaching something that had already confessed. The cobbles were damp beneath his shoes. A milk cart rattled by, the driver whistling a hymn that sounded slightly off-key, as if even melody distrusted its footing. Inside the hall, the morning light came slanting through high windows, pale and cold. Dust hung in it like slow snow. The portrait of Alderman Copley watched him from the wall, inscrutable, silent, faintly amused. Purbright set his hat on the piano and examined the space below the frame. The vent he had noticed the night before looked older now, its ironwork flaked with rust. He knelt, tapped it gently. A hollow echo answered. The wall beyond was not solid. He rose and crossed to the storeroom again. The phonograph still sat on the table, its horn pointing like an accusation. On the floor beside it lay a spool of thin wire glinting faintly in the light. He followed it with his eye. Through a hole in the skirting, beneath the wall, toward the hall beyond. "Efficient," he murmured, "and very nearly artful." A quiet footstep behind him announced Miss Truelove before her voice did. "Inspector, you're here early." "So is guilt," he said pleasantly. "It seldom sleeps in." She clasped her hands. "If this is to become another inquiry, I must protest."
"I've already told you everything I know." "Almost everything," Purbright corrected gently.
"But not why the alderman chose to address Mr. Tulliver so personally." "I didn't choose anything," she said, colour rising.
"I told you I never touched that machine." "No," said Purbright.
"But you knew it was here." Her eyes flickered toward the phonograph. A tiny motion, but enough. Purbright stepped aside, allowing the light to fall full on it. Whoever played it last night, he said, wanted witnesses, wanted the dead man's words to wound the living. That requires rehearsal. Kid the cylinder placed, the horn adjusted, the vent unsealed. Not the work of an impulsive hand. Miss Truelove said nothing. Her composure was fragile, the kind that creaks before it breaks. Purbright continued quietly, as though explaining a small domestic matter. The letter hidden behind the portrait, the note sent to me, the whisper of tobacco smoke, all signs of someone trying to remind us that the alderman's debts were not confined to his ledger. "Debts?" she whispered.
"Of affection," he said.
"Of trust."
"Of silence." Her hands tightened. "You think I think," Purbright said, "you were being blackmailed."
"By someone who knew you'd been more than the alderman's secretary." The room held its breath. Outside, the church bell struck the half-hour. She closed her eyes. "He promised me nothing, but people talked. Mr. Worsley knew. And when the alderman died, that portrait became my reminder. His face always there, judging. When I heard the whisper, I thought that he'd found another way to speak." Purbright finished softly. "Quite understandable," her voice trembled. "But I swear I didn't make it happen. I only moved the picture because I couldn't bear it. Then that letter, I found it wedged behind the frame. The words were his."
"I took nothing that wasn't owed."
He said that to me once. About love? Purbright regarded her kindly. Then whoever revived his voice knew that phrase would strike you hardest. He turned toward the window. Worsley had opportunity. He also had jealousy, key of your loyalty, perhaps, or your discretion. But Tulliver, his name was used because it concealed another's crime. Crime?
She whispered. Blackmail, he said. Not for money, for control.
Someone knew you feared exposure. They made a ghost of the alderman to keep you compliant. And when Tulliver's name was spoken, it was bait, meant to draw suspicion elsewhere, perhaps even to silence him. She stared at him. But why him? Purbright smiled faintly. Because he found what the blackmailer hid. The recording, perhaps.
Or the wire.
Guilt is rarely tidy. It leaves a trail like wet paint. He picked up the spool from the floor, turning it in his fingers. The wire runs from the phonograph to that vent, and from the vent to the wall behind the portrait. Anyone seated near the storeroom could have triggered it. Perhaps even our Mr. Worsley, standing so conveniently by the lamps. Miss Truelove swayed slightly.
You mean he planned it all? Not quite all, Purbright said.
He meant to frighten, not expose. But conscience, once set in motion, tends to elaborate the performance. He wound the wire loosely, replaced it on the table, and looked at her with that peculiar gentleness which always came before his conclusions. There's no need for courtrooms or headlines. You've been punished already, by memory and by the alderman's echo. As for Worsley, I shall have a word. Artists dislike mirrors that speak back. She said nothing more. He left her there, pale and still, amid the silent relics of other people's achievements. Outside, the day had brightened. Sunlight, thin as old silver, fell across the market square. Purbright walked slowly, thinking of how easily human deceit borrowed the language of the supernatural. A gramophone, a vent, a whisper, all the apparatus of guilt disguised as wonder. At the station, Sergeant Love met him with a newspaper already folded to the inevitable story. Flaxborough ghost laid to rest. Police credit science. Seems they've solved it without you, sir, Love said cheerfully. Purbright smiled, taking the paper. That's progress for you, Love. So efficient, it leaves out the human part entirely. Which part's that, sir? The one that keeps repeating itself, he said. Not the haunting, the remorse. He moved to the window where sunlight played on the dusty glass. Outside, a pair of children passed, laughing, their voices bright and harmless. The sound pleased him. Still, he added quietly, we've proved one thing. What's that, sir? That the dead seldom speak, Purbright said.
But the living are never quite silent. He drew the blind half shut.
The shadow fell gently across his desk, softening the light to something almost forgiving. Late afternoon drew a pale gold across the police yard, the kind of light that flatters even the most ordinary brick. In his office, Inspector Purbright poured 2 cups of tea from a pot that had seen better investigations. The steam curled upward, softening the air, mingling faintly with the smell of paper, pipe ash, and quiet certainty. Across from him sat Mr. Worsley, every inch of his person carefully arranged, his cuffs immaculate, his voice eager for innocence. Yet beneath the polish there was the stillness of a man already rehearsing guilt. I appreciate your invitation, Inspector, he said, attempting composure.
A private discussion. It's much more civilized than all that.
Misunderstanding at the society, Purbright stirred his cup without reply. The teaspoon made a small, deliberate sound against the china, steady as thought. Civilization, he said mildly, is merely guilt with better manners.
Milk, Worsley blinked.
Just a little, thank you. They sipped in companionable silence. Outside, the faint clatter of a passing cart dissolved into distance. Somewhere in the yard, a pigeon cooed with the self-importance of a bureaucrat. Purbright set his cup down. You have an ear for sound, I think. Your lectures suggest as much. And a painter's eye, of course, though one notices you've lately taken an interest in acoustics. The colour in Worsley's face shifted, almost imperceptibly.
You mean the incident with the phonograph?
Practical jest, nothing more. Ah, yes, Purbright said, practicality, the most elastic of virtues. You chose your words carefully last night. You called it demonstration through atmosphere. Admirably vague. Worsley's smile tightened.
Surely you don't think I think, Purbright interrupted gently, that you admired Miss Truelove once?
Possibly still do. Admiration, like paint, has a way of clinging beyond its proper use. The painter looked away, eyes drawn to the window where the reflection of Purbright's desk lamp shimmered on the glass.
Admiration, Inspector, is not a crime. No, said Purbright.
But envy is an inconvenience, Worsley laughed too quickly. You've been speaking to her? I have, Purbright replied. She's a woman of composure, but even composure phrase. You must have known she'd tell me of the letter, the whisper, the portrait moved. She believed herself haunted. You allowed it? The laughter died. She needed to remember, Worsley said quietly. She spent years serving a man who humiliated her in life and canonized himself in death. The town called her loyal. She called herself grateful.
I only wished to show her the truth. You showed her cruelty, Purbright said. No. Worsley leaned forward, voice trembling with the passion of self-justification.
I showed her release. The alderman's voice was a lie even when he breathed.
I wanted her to hear it one last time, to know that his words could still be manipulated, that power fades like pigment left in the sun. Purbright regarded him with something close to sympathy.
And poor Tulliver? Why frighten him?
I didn't mean to, Worsley murmured.
The name was a flourish and had an artist's instinct for drama.
I only wished the audience to listen. I didn't think he'd faint, Purbright's brows rose.
Artists seldom do. Still, I must admire the technique. The wiring through the vent, the phonograph perfectly timed. Even the scent of tobacco for authenticity. You rehearsed it well. Worsley's voice steadied. I wanted it perfect.
I thought she might understand, that perhaps she'd laugh. At last. She didn't laugh, Purbright said.
But she did forgive you.
That's rarer. A silence unfolded between them, not uncomfortable, but final.
The inspector poured a little more tea.
Tell me, he said, how long had you been recording those speeches?
Worsley looked up sharply. You know? I suspected, said Purbright. An artist who paints civic portraits would not waste the chance to capture a voice so suited to pomp. You used those recordings later, not for art, but for something more personal. It was years ago, Worsley said quietly.
After he died, I found the cylinders in the store cupboard. I should have destroyed them.
But they were fascinating. The way his tone filled a room even now, it reminded me of how small we'd all become under him. Resentment preserved in amber, Purbright mused.
I understand the impulse.
We all collect ghosts, Mr. Worsley. You merely gave yours a stage. The painter's eyes glistened.
You're not going to charge me.
For what? Purbright asked lightly.
Theft of an echo? Frightening a committee into moral awareness?
Hardly worth the paperwork. Relief flickered, then uncertainty. Then why summon me? To offer tea, Purbright said, and to suggest that confession, like art, improves with practice. You've made your first attempt. Now let it dry. Worsley gave a brittle laugh that turned into a sigh.
You think me ridiculous. I think you human, said Purbright.
Which is far more dangerous. He stood, signalling the end of ceremony. Worsley rose, adjusting his coat as though to recover dignity from its creases. Inspector, he said at last, will you tell her? Purbright paused, hand on the doorknob. That depends on whether she needs to know it or already does. Some truths are like paint thinner, Mr. Worsley. They remove what's unnecessary but take a little colour with them. The painter bowed his head, murmured a thank you that sounded very much like apology, and left. Purbright remained still for a moment, listening to the receding footsteps in the corridor, the faint squeak of the door at the far end, the echo closing behind. Then he returned to his desk and looked out at the town. The sky had begun to fade. a mild grey surrender. He poured himself the last of the tea, now cooling, and smiled faintly. "A conscience with a gramophone," he said to the empty room. Flaxborough never fails to modernize in the oddest ways. He reached for his pipe, tamped the tobacco, and struck a match. The flare lit his face for an instant, calm, lined, quietly amused as the smoke curled upward. The lamplight flickered against the window, and for a fleeting moment, the reflection looked like another man sitting across from him, listening, saying nothing, smiling faintly as if agreeing that truth once spoken has a way of haunting the speaker most of all. By the week's end, Flaxborough had resumed its preferred temperature of civility. The scandal, like a brief summer storm, had washed the pavements but left no permanent damage. The portrait of Alderman Copley hung once more in its appointed place above the piano. Restored, respectful, and thoroughly mute, Miss Truelove supervised the rehanging herself, with the measured solemnity of one attending a small funeral. Mr. Worsley was present too. Though quieter than usual, his once florid self-assurance thinned to something almost graceful. Neither spoke as the caretaker drove the last hook home. Only when the dust had settled did Purbright, standing unobtrusively near the door, remark, "It's remarkable
how silence can seem so loud once you've grown used to its opposite." Miss Truelove turned, a wry tremor of a smile appearing.
"You mean peace, Inspector?" "I rarely make that distinction," he said. The caretaker left, taking with him the smell of damp rope and furniture polish. Worsley remained by the window, hands clasped behind his back, gazing at the grey street beyond. "I suppose," he said, "we should be grateful that Flaxborough prefers polite forgetfulness to curiosity." "Gratitude," Purbright murmured, "is a sentiment best practiced, not declared." Miss Truelove glanced at him. "Then I'll practice it quietly." The hall was still for a moment, the sort of stillness that feels earned, as though time itself had agreed to behave. Purbright studied the portrait. It had regained its authority. Varnish repolished, frame straightened, the alderman's painted gaze restored to benevolent disapproval. He stepped closer, tilting his head. "A well-made likeness," he said softly. "He appears almost pleased with himself again." Miss Truelove's eyes followed his. "He was always most alive when being admired." "Perhaps," Purbright said, "he's still being indulged." Her mouth curved faintly. "If so, I hope he enjoys his rest."
"I've decided to let him keep it. An admirable policy," said Purbright.
"Most ghosts fade from neglect rather than exorcism." Worsley turned at that, his face composed but thinner, paler. "Inspector," he said, "I should thank you."
"You've been considerate. I'm told it's a professional flaw," Purbright replied.
"You'll find, however, that truth is usually less vindictive than those who chase it." Worsley inclined his head. "Even so, I've done harm."
"I can't deny that." "Then you're already ahead of most," said Purbright.
"A confession, like good art, needn't be displayed to be genuine." The painter gave a small, humourless laugh. "I doubt I shall paint again." "On the contrary," Purbright said. "You'll paint better." Regret is a fine undercoat. That earned him a look, part gratitude, part bewilderment. Miss Truelove gathered her gloves, her composure restored, and said with careful calm, "I think the Society has had quite enough excitement. Perhaps next month's lecture will be on still life." "An appropriate subject," said Purbright. "Flaxborough excels at it." He accompanied them to the door. Outside, the sky had cleared to a tender blue. The town's noise returned, horses on cobbles, the clink of teacups in shop windows, the occasional call of a paperboy proclaiming headlines that ignored them entirely. Miss Truelove paused on the step.
"Inspector, may I ask something?"
"Of course. If anyone else asks about that night, about what really happened, what will you say?" Purbright considered this, looking past her at the street where afternoon light caught the gilt letters of the Society's signboard. "I shall say," he answered slowly, "that the alderman's voice was heard once more, as he would have wished, loudly, and at someone else's expense. She almost smiled, though her eyes were damp.
"That's kind of you." "Kindness," said Purbright, "is only another word for delay."
"It gives truth time to become bearable." She nodded, then walked away, her figure receding into the soft radiance of the square. Worsley followed at a distance, his gait measured,
Uncertain, like a man relearning how to move without guilt's direction. Purbright remained a moment longer,
watching them vanish separately into the pattern of the town. Then he turned back to the hall. The door closed with a sigh, and the faint echo lingered, like a line not quite erased. He walked slowly to the portrait, hands clasped behind his back, and regarded it once more. The light through the window shifted, glancing across the painted face, so that for an instant the alderman seemed to change. The familiar complacency softening into something human.
almost regretful. "Ah," Purbright murmured.
"So even you can learn humility, given the right lighting." He stood there until the sun dipped lower and the colours of the room cooled again. Then, with a last small nod, he left, his footsteps unhurried along the wooden floor. Outside, the evening was clear and mild. Shop shutters clattered down. A bell from St. Chad's drifted across the rooftops, a single,
Unhurried chime. Purbright paused beneath the fading light,
looking toward the river where mist was beginning to rise again, pale and forgiving. He took out his pipe, tapped it gently against his palm, and said to no one in particular, politeness restored.
"And as ever, just in time for supper." The match flared, caught, and went out with a whisper. Evening settled upon Flaxborough with its usual tact, slowly, evenly, as though reluctant to interrupt.
The lamps were lit one by one along the high street, their reflections trembling in the shallow puddles left by a brief and apologetic rain. The air carried the scent of wet brick and faint tobacco, the kind that lingers from someone long gone, but not quite forgotten. Inspector Purbright walked without haste. He preferred to let the town close itself around him in its familiar sequence. The grocer's blind lowered with a sigh, a child's laugh vanishing into a doorway, a church bell marking the hour not for punctuality, but for reassurance. The day's case, if it could be called that, had resolved itself not through law but through fatigue, which was the more natural conclusion in Flaxborough. People here did not confess. They simply tired of concealing. He paused beneath the glow of a lamp-post outside the draper's. The light hummed faintly, turning the mist into a halo. Beyond it, the street narrowed toward the river, where the water moved with the same patient indifference it always had. Purbright drew his coat closer. The evening had the kind of chill that invited thought. He found his pipe, tamped it, but did not light it. The match would have spoiled the stillness. From the square came the sound of distant conversation, the kind that drifts between closed shops and after-hours windows. He could make out the names Miss Truelove, Mr. Worsley, the alderman, each spoken with that peculiar mixture of pity and relish that defines provincial charity. He smiled faintly. "Flaxborough," he murmured, "where gossip is the town's only renewable resource." He turned down Church Lane, where the lamps thinned and the shadows grew soft-edged. In one of the upper windows of the Art Society, a faint glow remained. Someone had forgotten to turn out the light. He hesitated, then retraced his steps. Inside, the air was faintly cool, tinged with the scent of drying flowers and floor polish. The caretaker's broom leaned against the wall, forgotten. The portrait of Alderman Copley hung in his usual station, solemn and superior. The lamplight from outside touched one corner of the frame, giving the painted surface a small, shifting gleam like the movement of breath. Purbright stood before it, hat in hand. "Well, Alderman," he said quietly, "you've had your say."
"And quite an audience for it." The painted face regarded him with its fixed expression of benevolent disapproval.
Yet something in the mouth, perhaps the angle of light, perhaps imagination, seemed softened. "Do you know," he went on, "you were rather useful in the end. You drew out honesty better than I ever could. Not the kind written in reports, but the other sort. The kind people tell themselves when no one's listening." He stepped closer. The varnish caught the reflection of his face beside the alderman's. The two men, one real, one rendered, seemed for a moment to share the same stillness, bound by an unspoken amusement at how little truth truly changes the world. "Miss Truelove will continue her meetings," he said. "The society will resume its tranquil mediocrity. Mr. Worsley, I imagine, will paint fruit for a while, until colour forgives him."
"And you, my dear sir, will remain here, watching, always looking pleased with your own mystery." He smiled, faintly ironic.
"A pity you can't hear the town now. You're quite the celebrity again."
"I suspect they'll forgive you everything." The clock above the piano struck 9, soft and deliberate.
The echo lingered among the rafters, then faded into the hum of the gaslights. Purbright took one last look at the portrait. The alderman's eyes, though still and glassy, seemed less accusatory now, almost companionable. Perhaps time had found even him a measure of humility. Purbright extinguished the lone lamp, leaving the hall to the hush of afterlight. As he closed the door, he fancied he heard the faint creak of the frame settling, like a sigh relieved of duty. The walk home took him through the narrow street, where the lamps grew sparser and the darkness folded comfortably around the corners. Windows glowed briefly, offering fragments of ordinary life, a kettle lifted, a hand turning a page, two silhouettes leaning toward one another in the dimming light. All the small, unnoticed truths of people who believe themselves unobserved. He reached his own gate as the clock of St. Chad's struck again, marking time with its customary discretion. From here the town appeared tranquil, a scatter of amber dots against the indigo air. Somewhere a cat yowled and was silenced by affection or authority. It was difficult to tell which. Purbright paused beneath the lintel, looking back once more toward the faint square where the Art Society stood. The light had at last gone out, only the memory of it remained, hovering faintly behind his eyes. He thought then of Worsley's trembling confession, of Miss Truelove's weary dignity, of the portrait itself. That echo of a man who had outlived his voice. Truth, he reflected, was much like light in a painting. It could illuminate or distort, depending on the angle from which one viewed it. He unlocked his door, stepped inside, and set his hat upon its hook. The house was silent, but for the gentle ticking of the clock, an old one that had been his since his early years in uniform. He loosened his collar, poured a modest measure of whiskey, and sat by the fire. For a while he said nothing. The flames moved lazily, colouring the room in amber and shadow. At last he murmured, "Spoken truths never vanish. They only wait for quieter rooms." He leaned back, letting the warmth take the edge off the day. Outside the wind stirred faintly in the street, a whisper against the eaves, a sound almost like breathing. In the distance, the river moved on, unhurried and unchanged. And somewhere, though whether in memory or mere suggestion he could not have said, a faint creak of canvas sounded, as though an old portrait, pleased with its final silence, had smiled in the dark. Thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The end.